So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, in this very moment, you are surrounded by billions of tiny switches. Billions. Inside your phone, inside any laptop or tablet nearby, inside the Wi-Fi router blinking quietly in the other room, inside the smart thermostat on the wall if you have one, inside the little chip on your credit card, inside the digital clock on your nightstand. Billions of switches, each one either on or off, open or closed, 1 or 0, flipping back and forth millions or even billions of times every single second. And those switches, those impossibly tiny, impossibly fast switches, are doing something that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone alive 200 years ago. They're thinking, or at least they're doing something so close to thinking that the distinction gets genuinely hard to pin down. That's computing. That's what a computer actually is. When you strip away the glowing screens and the sleek aluminum cases and the colorful app icons, it's switches. An unfathomable number of switches, arranged in extraordinarily clever patterns, flipping on and off in precise sequences, and somehow, the result is everything from your weather forecast to a video call with someone on the other side of the planet, to a movie generated entirely by artificial intelligence. And the story of how we got here, how humanity went from counting on fingers to building machines that can process trillions of operations per second, is one of the most fascinating, tangled human stories in all of engineering. It's full of geniuses and frauds, of accidents and obsessions, of machines that filled entire rooms and now fit on your fingernail, of ideas that were 100 years ahead of their time, and ideas that seemed brilliant but turned out to be dead ends. And we're going to walk through all of it tonight. Slowly, no rush. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that's completely fine. That's kind of the point. The story will keep unfolding, and wherever you come back in, there'll be something interesting waiting. So let's start at the very beginning. And I mean the very beginning. Because the history of computing doesn't start with electronics, or even with machines. It starts with a much simpler problem, one that humans ran into the moment they started building civilizations. How do you keep track of numbers? Think about what life was like 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, in what's now Iraq. You're a farmer, or a merchant, or a temple administrator, in one of the first cities on earth. You've got sheep. You've got jars of grain. You've got bales of wool. You're trading with people in the next village, and you need to know how much you have, how much you owe, how much you're owed. You need to count, and for small numbers, your fingers work fine. 10 fingers, 10 sheep, no problem. But what happens when you have 200 sheep? Or when you need to calculate how much grain to set aside for planting next season based on how much land you're farming? Or when the temple needs to track offerings from dozens of different families over an entire year? Suddenly, you need something better than fingers. The earliest solution was almost laughably simple, but it worked. Clay tokens, little shaped pieces of clay, each shape representing a different commodity. A small cone might mean a measure of barley. A sphere might mean a bushel of wheat. A disc might mean a sheep. You keep them in a clay envelope, a hollow ball of clay called a bulla, and when you need to know what's in a shipment or verify a transaction, you break it open and count the tokens inside. Archaeologists have found thousands of these tokens across the ancient Near East, dating back to around 8,000 BCE, 10,000 years ago. And here's what's fascinating. Many historians believe that writing itself evolved from this system. When people started pressing the tokens into the soft clay of the envelope before sealing it, to create a record on the outside so you wouldn't have to break it open, those impressions gradually became stylized symbols, Symbols on clay tablets. Cuneiform writing. The first information technology arose not from poetry or prayer, but from accounting, from the need to count things and keep records. That's a detail I just love. The most transformative invention in human history, writing, may have started as a receipt system for grain and livestock, but tokens and tally marks only get you so far. At some point, you need to actually calculate, add things up, subtract, multiply. And this is where one of the oldest and most underappreciated computing devices in history enters the story: the abacus. Now, you might picture the abacus as a children's toy, those colorful beads on wires that you see in preschool classrooms. But the abacus, in its various forms, was the primary calculating tool for most of human civilization, for thousands of years. Think about that. Thousands of years. The earliest versions appeared in Mesopotamia and Egypt, probably around 2500 BCE or so, though the exact dating is debated. They weren't the bead-on-wire frames we picture. The earliest abaci were grooves cut into stone or clay, with pebbles placed in the grooves to represent numbers. The Latin word calculus actually means small stone. We get the word calculate from the act of moving pebbles around on counting boards. Over the centuries, different cultures developed their own versions of the abacus, each beautifully adapted to their particular number systems and calculating needs. The Chinese suanpan, with its 2 beads above the bar and 5 below, optimized for their traditional base 16 system. The Japanese soroban, refined to 1 bead above and 4 below, a model of elegant minimalism. The Roman hand abacus, a pocket-sized bronze device with sliding beads and grooves, used by merchants throughout the Roman Empire. And here's the thing about the abacus that most people don't appreciate. In the hands of a skilled operator, it is fast, seriously fast. There's a famous demonstration from 1946, and we'll get to why 1946 matters a lot for computing in a little while, where a Japanese soroban champion named Kiyoshi Matsuzaki competed against a U.S. Army private named Thomas Nathan Wood, who was using one of the best electric calculating machines available at the time, a state-of-the-art adding machine. The contest was in Tokyo, organized by the Stars and Stripes newspaper. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, a mix of problems of varying difficulty. And the soroban won, not narrowly, decisively, 4 events to 1, with 1 draw. A human being, with a frame of wooden beads, outperformed an electric machine. In 1946, that tells you something about how powerful a simple tool can be when it's been refined over millennia and operated by someone who's spent a lifetime mastering it. The soroban masters could add columns of numbers so fast their fingers were literally a blur. But the abacus, for all its speed and elegance, has a fundamental limitation. It's a tool that helps a human calculate. It doesn't calculate by itself. The intelligence is in the operator's hands, in their training, in the procedures they've memorized for carrying tens and handling negative results. The abacus doesn't know anything about arithmetic. It's a memory aid, a way of organizing intermediate results, a physical scratch pad. The person does the thinking, and for most of history, that was fine. But eventually, people started asking a different question, a more ambitious question. What if you could build a machine that actually did the calculating itself? What if you could turn a crank and have the answer just appear? That question takes us to 17th century Europe, and to a cast of characters who were, honestly, some of the most remarkable minds who ever lived. Let's start with a Scotsman named John Napier. Born in 1550 at Merchiston Castle near Edinburgh, Napier was a Protestant landowner, a theologian who wrote passionate tracts about the Book of Revelation, and, somewhat incongruously, one of the most inventive mathematicians of his age. He's most famous for inventing logarithms, which might sound dry, but was actually a monumental achievement. Here's the basic idea. Multiplication of large numbers is hard and slow. Addition is easy and fast. Logarithms let you turn multiplication into addition. If you want to multiply two big numbers, you look up their logarithms in a table, add those logarithms together, which is easy, and then look up the result in the table to find the answer. Astronomers, who spent huge chunks of their lives doing tedious multiplication of large numbers by hand, calculating planetary orbits, predicting eclipses, were ecstatic when Napier published his logarithm tables in 1614. The French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace later said that logarithms, by shortening the labor of calculation, doubled the life of astronomers. But Napier also invented something more physical, a set of calculating rods made of bone or ivory or wood that became known as Napier's bones. Each rod had multiplication tables inscribed on its faces, arranged in a clever diagonal pattern, and by placing the rods side by side, you could read off the products of multi-digit multiplications with just a little addition. It was a lookup table made physical, simple, portable, and genuinely useful. Napier published his description of these rods in 1617, the year he died, and while they weren't automatic, you still had to read and add up the partial products yourself. They represented something important. They were an attempt to offload mental work onto a physical device, to make the tool do more of the work and the person do less. And then, just a few decades later, a young French mathematician took this idea much further. His name was Blaise Pascal. Born in 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand in central France, Pascal was one of those alarming prodigies who seem to appear every few generations and make everyone around them feel slightly inadequate. His father, Etienne, was a tax commissioner and a talented mathematician himself, and he recognized early that his son was extraordinary. Though he initially tried to keep young Blaise away from mathematics, worried it would interfere with his Latin and Greek studies. That didn't work. By the age of 12, Blaise had independently worked out many of the propositions of Euclidean geometry on his own, drawing diagrams on the floor of his room with charcoal. By 16, he'd written a significant paper on conic sections that impressed even the great René Descartes, though Descartes found it hard to believe a 16-year-old had written it. But at around 18 or 19, Pascal turned his attention to a practical problem. His father had been appointed to a tedious administrative position in Rouen, the Royal Tax Commissioner for Upper Normandy, that involved endless calculations. Columns of figures representing taxes owed, taxes collected, arrears, adjustments, added and re-added, checked and rechecked, day after day. It was mind-numbing work, and young Blaise watched his father grinding through it night after night, and decided he could build a machine to do it. The result, completed around 1642, when Pascal was just 19, was the Pascaline, and it was, genuinely, a marvel. A small brass box, about 14 inches long, 9 inches wide, and 3 inches tall, roughly the size of a shoebox, with a row of 6 numbered wheels on top. You dialed in the numbers using a stylus, turning each wheel to the appropriate digit, and the machine added them up mechanically. The real cleverness was in the carry mechanism. When a wheel passed from 9 to 0, a small weighted arm called a sautoir would fall, engaging a tooth that advanced the next wheel by 1 position, just the way you carry a 1 when you add 9 plus 1 by hand and get 10. It was real, honest-to-goodness mechanical computation. Turn the wheels, and the correct sum appeared in little windows on the top of the box. Now, the Pascaline wasn't perfect. The carry mechanism was clever but delicate. Sometimes the sautoir wouldn't engage properly, especially when carries needed to cascade across multiple digits. The machines were expensive to build. Each one had to be handcrafted by skilled Rouen clockmakers, and the fine brass gears required extensive hand finishing. Pascal was fiercely protective of his invention, obtaining a royal privilege, essentially a patent, that forbade anyone else from making calculating machines in France without his permission. He built about 50 of them over the next decade and tried to sell them commercially, even writing advertising copy that emphasized their ease of use. But they never really caught on. They were too expensive for most potential customers, too delicate for everyday use, and honestly, a skilled clerk with an abacus could work just as fast or faster. But the Pascaline mattered enormously as a proof of concept. It showed that a machine, a physical mechanism of gears and wheels, could perform arithmetic without human intervention. You set up the inputs, turned the crank, and the machine produced the correct output. The calculating wasn't happening in anyone's head. It was happening in the brass. That was the revolutionary insight, even if the market wasn't ready for it. And then, about 30 years later, someone came along who wanted to push the idea even further. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, Leibniz is one of those figures who is almost comically accomplished. Born in Leipzig in 1646, he was a philosopher, a mathematician, a diplomat, a lawyer, a historian, a linguist, and a mining engineer. The list goes on and on. He read everything, knew everyone, corresponded with scholars across Europe, and produced original work in more fields than most people can even name. He independently invented calculus at roughly the same time as Isaac Newton, which led to one of the bitterest priority disputes in the history of science, a feud that poisoned relations between English and continental mathematics for over a century, with partisans on both sides hurling accusations of plagiarism. Modern historians generally agree that Leibniz and Newton developed calculus independently, using different notation and approaching the problem from different angles. But at the time, the dispute was vicious and deeply personal, and it overshadowed much of Leibniz's later career. But Leibniz was also deeply interested in mechanical calculation. He saw Pascal's machine and thought, addition is nice, but what about multiplication? Pascal's machine could only add and subtract. If you wanted to multiply, you had to do it as repeated addition, which was tedious. Leibniz wanted a machine that could multiply directly. In the early 1670s, Leibniz designed and built what he called the stepped reckoner. It used a clever new mechanism, the Leibniz wheel, a cylinder with 9 teeth of varying lengths arranged along its surface, that could perform multiplication and division directly. You set the multiplicand on one set of dials, the multiplier on another, turned the crank the appropriate number of times, and the machine ground through the calculation mechanically. It was, in concept, a true 4-function calculator. In practice, the stepped reckoner had problems. The carry mechanism was unreliable. Carries sometimes failed to propagate correctly across multiple digit positions, giving wrong answers. The prototype that survives in a museum in Hanover, Germany, has known bugs. Leibniz probably never got it fully working to his satisfaction, and he tinkered with the design for decades without resolving all the issues. But the Leibniz wheel itself was a brilliant piece of mechanical engineering, and it became the basis for mechanical calculators for the next 300 years. Well into the 20th century, the Brunsviga and other desktop calculating machines used variations of Leibniz's stepped drum mechanism. The idea was that good, that durable. But here's what's really interesting about Leibniz, and it's something that connects directly to the computers you use today. Leibniz was fascinated by the binary number system. He wasn't the first person to think about binary. There are antecedents in ancient Indian mathematics, and the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination text, uses a system of solid and broken lines that maps onto binary notation in an uncanny way. Leibniz himself noticed the I Ching connection and was deeply intrigued by it. But he was the first person to develop binary arithmetic systematically, showing in a 1703 paper how any number could be represented using only two symbols, 0 and 1, and how you could do all the standard operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, in this two-symbol system. He even saw something almost mystical in binary, 1 and 0, something and nothing, being and void. He connected it to the idea of divine creation from nothingness. And here's the kicker. Leibniz even imagined, at least in general terms, a calculating machine that used binary instead of decimal. He sketched ideas for a device that used marbles, a marble present for 1, a marble absent for 0, rolling through grooves and triggering mechanisms. He never built it. The technology of the early 18th century wasn't up to the task. But the idea that you could represent all of arithmetic and potentially all of logic using just two states, on and off, yes and no, 1 and 0, that idea would turn out to be the single most important insight in the entire history of computing. Every digital computer ever built, from the room-sized behemoths of the 1940s to the phone in your pocket right now, operates in binary, ones and zeros. Leibniz saw it 300 years ago. He just couldn't build it yet. Now, after Leibniz, the 18th and early 19th centuries saw plenty of other mechanical calculators. Thomas de Colmar's arithmometer, introduced in the 1820s, became the first mass-produced calculating machine and was a genuine commercial success. But all of these machines, clever as they were, shared a fundamental limitation. They could only do one operation at a time. You set up a problem, turned the crank, got an answer, and then set up the next problem manually. They were calculators, not computers. And the difference is crucial. A calculator does what you tell it, one step at a time. A computer follows a sequence of instructions. A program, automatically, making decisions along the way, looping back when needed, branching in different directions based on what it finds. That's the leap. That's what separates a pocket calculator from the machine you're using to listen to this. And this is where we arrive at one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire history of technology. A man whose ideas were so far ahead of his time that the world, literally, could not keep up with him. His name was Charles Babbage, and his story is one of obsession, brilliance, frustration, and the maddening gap between what the mind can conceive and what the hands can build. Babbage was born in London on December 26, 1791. His father was a wealthy banker, which meant that young Charles never had to worry about money, a luxury that would prove both a blessing and a curse, because it allowed him to spend decades on projects that never generated any income. He was sickly as a child and largely self-educated in mathematics, devouring textbook after textbook from his father's library. By the time he arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, he found to his disappointment that he already knew more mathematics than most of his tutors. He was a restless, energetic, prickly personality, brilliant and fully aware of it, impatient with people who couldn't keep up, and prone to feuds that would consume years of his life. He once waged a sustained, passionate public campaign against organ grinders and other street musicians in London, whom he considered an intolerable nuisance that disrupted his concentration. He wrote letters to newspapers. He lobbied Parliament. He calculated, because of course he calculated, that over his lifetime, a quarter of his working potential had been destroyed by street noise. He was not, let's say, an easy man to get along with, but his mind was extraordinary. In the early 1820s, Babbage was working with mathematical tables, logarithm tables, astronomical tables, navigation tables, actuarial tables. These tables were the computational infrastructure of the 19th century. They were the Google of their day, in a sense. If you needed to know the sine of an angle, or the logarithm of a number, or the compound interest on a loan, you looked it up in a table. Engineers, navigators, scientists, bankers, insurance companies, everyone who needed precise calculations relied on these printed tables of pre-computed values. And the tables were full of errors, computed by hand by teams of human calculators, often poorly paid and not particularly motivated, transcribed by hand, typeset by hand for printing. At every stage, errors crept in, and those errors could be catastrophic. A mistake in a navigation table could send a ship onto the rocks. An error in an astronomical table could throw off a celestial observation by just enough to make a discovery invisible. People actually died because of errors in mathematical tables. Babbage was obsessed with eliminating those errors, and around 1821, while checking a set of astronomical tables computed by human clerks, he reportedly exclaimed to his colleague John Herschel, the son of the great astronomer William Herschel, something to the effect of, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam," by which he meant by machine, without human fallibility, without the boredom and distraction and carelessness that made human computers unreliable. It was, in its way, the same frustration that would drive every advance in computing for the next 2 centuries. Humans make mistakes. Machines, if they're built right, don't. From that frustration, the difference engine was born. The idea was elegant. Many of the mathematical functions in those tables, logarithms, trigonometric functions, polynomial approximations, could be computed using a method called finite differences, which reduces complex calculations to a series of simple additions. No multiplication, no division, just addition, repeated over and over in a specific pattern. And addition was exactly what mechanical calculators were good at, so Babbage designed a machine that would mechanize the entire process, compute the values step by step, using the method of differences, and even set the type for printing, so the results would go straight from the calculating mechanism to the printed page without any human transcription. Errors eliminated at every stage. The vision was magnificent. The British government thought so too. They funded the project to the tune of £17,000 over the next decade, an enormous sum, equivalent to the cost of building 2 warships. But the difference engine was never completed. The engineering challenges were immense. Babbage needed thousands of precision-machined brass gears, manufactured to tolerances that pushed the absolute limits of what 19th-century metalworking could achieve. His relationship with his chief engineer, Joseph Clement, deteriorated badly. Bitter disputes over costs, over workshop ownership, over who had the rights to the specialized tools and jigs that had been created for the project. Clement eventually walked off the job, taking the tools with him, since by law they belonged to the craftsmen who made them. The government lost patience and pulled the funding. By the late 1830s, the difference engine was an expensive, unfinished monument to ambition outrunning capability. Only a small demonstration section was ever completed, but that section worked perfectly. But here's the thing, and this is what makes Babbage's story so remarkable. Even while the difference engine was still unfinished, Babbage had already moved on to something far more ambitious, something that, if you understand what it was, will genuinely take your breath away. He called it the analytical engine, and it was, in every meaningful sense, a general-purpose programmable computer, designed in the 1830s. More than 100 years before the first electronic computers were built, Think about what that means for a second. In an age of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps and quill pens, Charles Babbage designed a machine that had a central processing unit. He called it the mill, where arithmetic operations were performed. It had a memory. He called it the store, capable of holding 1,000 numbers of 50 digits each. It could branch, meaning it could make decisions based on intermediate results and execute different sequences of operations depending on what it found. It could loop, repeat a set of instructions over and over until a condition was met. It read its instructions from punched cards, an idea Babbage borrowed from the Jacquard loom, a French weaving machine that used cards with holes punched in them to control the pattern of a fabric. The Jacquard loom could weave any pattern you wanted, automatically, just by changing the cards. Babbage saw this and realized you could use the same principle to control a calculating machine. Different cards, different calculations. A programmable machine. Every fundamental component of a modern computer was there, in Babbage's designs, in the 1830s. Processor, memory, input, output, conditional branching, looping. The architecture was complete, and Babbage never built it. Couldn't build it. The engineering requirements were even more extreme than the difference engine. We're talking about a machine that would have contained tens of thousands of precision-machined gears, would have weighed several tons, would have been the size of a small locomotive, and would have been powered by a steam engine. The manufacturing technology of the 1830s simply was not equal to the task. Babbage spent the rest of his life refining the designs, filling notebook after notebook with increasingly detailed mechanical drawings, thousands of pages of them, now preserved in the Science Museum in London, and never saw his greatest creation become real. He died in 1871, largely forgotten by the public, the analytical engine existing only on paper. But the designs were sound. Modern engineers who have studied Babbage's notebooks in detail confirm that his architecture would have worked. In 1991, the Science Museum in London actually built a complete difference engine number 2 from Babbage's original plans, using only manufacturing techniques that would have been available in the 19th century. It worked perfectly, flawlessly. 31 digits of precision, 4,000 moving parts, 5 tons of brass and steel, and it produced correct results every single time they tested it. Babbage was right. He was right about everything. He just couldn't get anyone to build it in his lifetime. And then there's Ada, Augusta Ada King, Countess of Lovelace. Born in 1815, the only legitimate daughter of Lord Byron, the great Romantic poet, though she never really knew her father. Byron left England shortly after Ada's birth, amid a swirl of scandal, and died in Greece when Ada was 8. Her mother, Lady Byron, was determined that Ada would not inherit her father's wild poetic temperament. The prescribed remedy was mathematics. Lady Byron had Ada tutored intensively in mathematics and science from an early age, treating rigorous logical thinking as a kind of inoculation against the dangerous passions of poetry. And here's the irony. It didn't work, at least not in the way Lady Byron intended. The mathematical education didn't suppress Ada's imagination. It transformed it. Ada brought a visionary, almost poetic sensibility to mathematics. She called her own approach poetical science, and saw in abstract symbols and logical operations a kind of beauty that was, in its own way, as romantic as anything her father ever wrote. Ada met Babbage at a party in London in 1833, when she was just 17 years old. Babbage demonstrated a portion of his difference engine, and Ada was transfixed. Most of the other guests, aristocrats, politicians, socialites, were impressed the way you're impressed by a clever magic trick. Ada understood what it meant. She grasped the mathematical principles behind the machine immediately, and she wanted to know more. Babbage was charmed and impressed. He called her the enchantress of number. Their intellectual friendship lasted for years. And in 1843, Ada published a set of notes on the analytical engine that went far beyond anything Babbage himself had written publicly. She was working from an article about the engine, written by the Italian mathematician Luigi Menabrea, who had attended a series of lectures Babbage gave in Turin, and she translated it from French into English. But her own notes, appended to the translation, were 3 times longer than the original article, and in those notes, she did something remarkable. She included what is widely recognized as the first computer program, a detailed, step-by-step algorithm for the analytical engine to compute Bernoulli numbers. Card by card, operation by operation, she laid out the sequence of instructions the machine would follow. A program written for a computer that had never been built and wouldn't be built for more than a century. But Ada's contribution went deeper than that specific program. She grasped something about the analytical engine that even Babbage sometimes struggled to articulate clearly. She understood that the machine was not merely a calculator, not just a device for doing arithmetic faster. It could manipulate symbols according to rules. Any symbols, not just numbers. It could, in principle, work with any kind of information that could be encoded in a symbolic form. She wrote that the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity, if the fundamental relations of musical sounds could be expressed in terms the engine could process. This was in 1843. She was imagining something, the general-purpose manipulation of symbolic information by machine, that most people wouldn't begin to grasp for another 100 years. She also saw the limitations with remarkable clarity. She wrote that the analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. That observation, sometimes called Lady Lovelace's objection, has echoed through every debate about machine intelligence for the next 180 years. Can a machine only do what it's told? Or can it, given enough complexity and the right kind of instructions, produce results that genuinely surprise its creators? We're still arguing about that one, vigorously. Ada died of cancer in 1852, at just 36, the same age at which her father had died. Babbage outlived her by nearly 20 years, tinkering with his designs to the end but never building the analytical engine. And their shared dream would wait for the 20th century and entirely different technology to finally become real. But the ideas were all there. The architecture, the programming, the vision. All of it laid down in the Victorian era, waiting for the world to catch up. Now, while Babbage and Lovelace were imagining programmable computing, something else was happening that would prove equally important. And it wasn't happening in a workshop or an inventor's study. It was happening in the world of pure mathematics, in the realm of abstract logic, and it involved a quiet, largely self-taught English mathematician named George Boole, who had an idea so simple and so powerful that it would eventually become the mathematical foundation of every digital computer ever built. Boole was born in 1815 in Lincoln, England, the same year as Ada Lovelace, as it happens. But his background couldn't have been more different from hers. His father was a cobbler, a maker of shoes, who loved mathematics and science as hobbies, but lacked the money to give his children much formal education. George attended a local school until about the age of 16, and after that, he was on his own. He taught himself Latin, Greek, French, German, and Italian from borrowed books. He taught himself mathematics by reading the great works, Lagrange, Laplace, Newton, without any tutor or guide. And at the age of 19, needing to support his family, he opened his own school. He taught classes during the day and did mathematics in the hours before dawn and after his students went home, working by candlelight in the quiet of an empty schoolroom. The work he produced in those stolen hours was so original, so startlingly good, that when it reached professional mathematicians, they were astonished. This self-taught schoolteacher in a provincial town was doing work that rivaled anything coming out of Cambridge or Oxford. In 1847, Boole published a slim, modest book called The Mathematical Analysis of Logic. In 1854, he published a more complete version called An Investigation of the Laws of Thought. And here's what he did, and why it matters so much for our story. He showed that the operations of human logical reasoning, the basic moves of deductive thought, the and, or, and not, that underlie every argument and every chain of inference, could be expressed as mathematical operations on variables that take only two values, true and false, 1 and 0. He created an algebra of logic. You could write logical propositions as equations, manipulate them using algebraic rules, simplify them, combine them, and derive new conclusions with the same mechanical reliability that you get from ordinary algebra. No ambiguity, no appeal to intuition or common sense. Just symbols and rules. Now, think about what that means in the context of computing. We've already seen that Leibniz showed arithmetic could be done in binary, ones and zeros. Boole has now shown that logic itself can be done in binary, true and false, which map directly onto 1 and 0. And since the physical hardware of a computer, its circuits, its switches, its transistors, naturally has two states, on and off, current flowing or not flowing, this means you could build a machine that doesn't just calculate numbers, but evaluates logical conditions. That makes decisions. If this condition is true and that condition is true, then do this thing, else do that other thing. That's Boolean logic. And that is the foundation of every if statement in every program ever written, every logic gate in every microprocessor ever fabricated, every decision that every computer makes billions of times per second. But here's the thing, and this is one of those wonderful examples of ideas that arrive decades or centuries before anyone knows what to do with them. Boole published his work in the 1850s, and mathematicians admired it, but nobody connected it to computing for almost 80 years. The machines that could use Boolean logic didn't exist yet. Babbage's analytical engine was never built. Mechanical calculators were decimal, not binary. Boole's work sat in the libraries, elegant and powerful, and almost entirely unused for practical purposes. A solution waiting patiently for its problem. Boole himself died young, in 1864, at the age of 49, reportedly from pneumonia, after walking to the university in the rain and then lecturing in wet clothes. He never knew what his ideas would become. Now let's talk about what happened to practical computing in the second half of the 19th century, because there's a detour here that turned out to be enormously important, and it starts with a problem that seems utterly mundane: the United States Census. The U.S. Constitution requires a census every 10 years, and by 1880, the country was growing fast. Immigration, westward expansion, urbanization, the population was booming, and the census was drowning. The 1880 census took nearly 8 years to fully tabulate. 8 years. By the time the results were complete, it was nearly time to start the 1890 census. And 1890 was going to be worse. More people, more questions on the form, more data to process. The Census Bureau was facing a genuine crisis. At the current rate, the census would take longer to tabulate than the 10-year gap between censuses. The data would be obsolete before it was finished. Something had to change. Enter Herman Hollerith. Born in Buffalo, New York, in 1860, the son of German immigrants, Hollerith studied at the Columbia School of Mines and then took a job at the Census Bureau, where he saw the tabulation problem firsthand. Rooms full of clerks, hand-tallying data from millions of paper forms, a process so slow and error-prone it was barely functional. And Hollerith had an idea that would transform data processing. What if you could encode each person's census data onto a punched card, a stiff piece of cardboard about the size of a dollar bill, with holes punched in specific positions to represent age, sex, race, occupation, marital status, place of birth, state of residence, and then run those cards through a machine that could read the holes and tabulate the results automatically. The inspiration for punched cards came, indirectly, from the Jacquard loom, the same technology that had inspired Babbage. But Hollerith's innovation was in how the cards were read. He designed an electrical sensing system. Each card was placed on a bed of small cups filled with mercury. A set of spring-loaded pins, one for each possible hole position, pressed down onto the card. Where there was a hole, the pin passed through the cardboard, dipped into the mercury below, and completed an electrical circuit, which advanced a mechanical counting dial by one. Where there was no hole, the pin hit the card and stopped. No circuit. No count. It was brilliantly simple. Binary, in effect. Hole or no hole, circuit or no circuit, 1 or 0. And it was fast. A skilled operator could process several cards per minute, and the counting was automatic and accurate. No mental arithmetic required. Hollerith's machines were used for the 1890 census, and the results were dramatic. The basic population count, how many people in the United States, was completed in just 6 weeks. The full tabulation, with all the cross-tabulations and detailed breakdowns, took about 2.5 years, even though the population had grown by 25% since 1880. The machines saved the government an estimated $5 million. Hollerith became something of a celebrity in the world of data processing. He patented his system, founded a company called the Tabulating Machine Company, and started selling his machines to census bureaus and large businesses around the world. Russia used them. Austria used them. Insurance companies used them. Railroads used them. And here's where the business story gets interesting, because it leads directly to one of the most important companies in the history of technology. Hollerith's Tabulating Machine Company went through several mergers. In 1911, it merged with 2 other companies, the International Time Recording Company and the Computing Scale Company of America, to form a conglomerate called the Computing Tabulating Recording Company, or CTR. It sold everything from time clocks to meat scales to punched card tabulators. Not exactly a focused business strategy, but in 1914, CTR hired a forceful, ambitious salesman named Thomas J. Watson Sr. as general manager. Watson, who had previously worked at National Cash Register under the notoriously aggressive John Henry Patterson, transformed CTR. He focused the company on the tabulating machine business, invested heavily in research and development, built a formidable sales force, and in 1924, renamed the company to something with a bit more grandeur: International Business Machines, IBM. That's right, IBM, the company that would dominate computing for much of the 20th century, the company whose mainframes would become synonymous with corporate computing, the company whose engineers would help design the guidance computers for the Apollo missions, traces its direct lineage back to Herman Hollerith's census punch cards. And the punched card itself would remain a fundamental part of computing infrastructure well into the 1970s. If you're over a certain age, or if you've ever watched an old movie set in a computing lab, you might recognize those stiff rectangular cards with their rows of tiny rectangular holes, each card holding 80 columns of data. For decades, that was how you talked to a computer. You punched your program onto a stack of cards, carefully arranged in the right order, carried the deck to the computer room, handed it to an operator through a little window, and waited, sometimes hours, sometimes overnight, to get your results back as a printout. Drop the card deck and the cards would scatter everywhere, and you'd have to sort them all back into order before you could submit your job again. There's an entire generation of programmers who still flinch at the memory. But the punched card was, for its era, a genuinely revolutionary data storage and input technology. So as we move into the early 20th century, let's take stock of where we are. We have mechanical calculators on desks in offices and banks, the descendants of Pascal and Leibniz, by now manufactured commercially by companies like Brunsviga, Monroe, and Marchant. We have punched card tabulating machines, processing huge data sets for governments and corporations. IBM, growing into a major company on the strength of them. We have the theoretical foundations laid. Babbage's architecture for a programmable computer, Boole's algebra for binary logic, sitting in libraries and notebooks, waiting to be connected to each other and to real hardware. And we have a world that's about to be transformed by two forces, electricity and war. The person who connected Boole's abstract logic to actual physical circuits, who built the bridge between a Victorian mathematical theory and the electronic hardware that would make computing possible, was a 21-year-old graduate student at MIT. His name was Claude Shannon. And his 1937 master's thesis is arguably the most important master's thesis ever written. I realize that's a big claim, but hear me out. Shannon was born in 1916 in Petoskey, Michigan, a small resort town on the shores of Lake Michigan. His father was a judge and a businessman. His mother was a language teacher and, for a time, the principal of the local high school. Claude grew up tinkering. He loved building things, model airplanes, a radio-controlled boat, and most impressively, a makeshift telegraph system that connected his house to a friend's house half a mile away, using the barbed wire of a nearby pasture fence as the transmission line. He studied electrical engineering and mathematics at the University of Michigan, and then went to MIT for graduate school. And at MIT, he had the good fortune to land a job as a research assistant, working on the differential analyzer, a large analog computing machine built by the engineering dean, Vannevar Bush. The differential analyzer solved differential equations mechanically, using a complicated system of gears, shafts, wheel and disc integrators, and, crucially, a network of electromechanical relays that configured the machine for different problems. And this is where the lightning bolt hits. Shannon, spending his days configuring relay circuits for the differential analyzer, realized that the circuits he was building were doing something that looked exactly like Boolean algebra. A relay was either open or closed, 1 or 0, true or false. You could connect relays in series to create an AND function. The current flows through the series only if both relays are closed. You could connect relays in parallel to create an OR function. The current flows if either relay is closed. You could use a normally closed relay to create a NOT function. The current flows only when the relay is not energized, and stops flowing when it is. Every fundamental operation in Boole's logic had a direct, simple, physical counterpart in electrical switching circuits. Shannon wrote this up in his master's thesis, titled A Symbolic Analysis of Relay and Switching Circuits. He showed, with mathematical rigor, that any Boolean logical function, no matter how complex, could be implemented as a circuit of electrical switches, and conversely, that any circuit of switches could be analyzed, simplified, and optimized using Boolean algebra. It was the Rosetta Stone between abstract logic and physical hardware. 80 years after Boole invented his algebra of logic, a 21-year-old engineer had found its perfect application. After Shannon, the path from mathematical logic to working computer hardware was clear. All you needed were switches, enough of them, fast enough, connected in the right patterns, and you could compute anything that logic could describe. Shannon went on to become one of the most remarkable intellects of the 20th century. He essentially created information theory, the mathematical framework for understanding communication, data compression, error correction, and the fundamental limits of how much information can be transmitted through a noisy channel. That work alone would have made him immortal. He also loved building whimsical gadgets: a flame-throwing trumpet, a juggling machine, a computer that played chess, a device whose sole purpose was to reach out an arm and turn itself off when you switched it on. He rode a unicycle through the halls of Bell Laboratories, where he spent most of his career. He was, by all accounts, a quietly joyful person who saw mathematics as a kind of play. But the master's thesis was the contribution that opened the door to the digital age. And the world was about to need that door opened very badly, because the late 1930s brought something that would accelerate the development of computing faster than any peacetime motivation ever could have. War. The Second World War. It's hard to overstate how much World War II transformed computing. Before the war, computing was a niche interest, a handful of academics building experimental relay calculators, a scattering of punch card installations in government census bureaus and insurance company basements. After the war, computing was a strategic national priority. The war didn't invent computing, but it compressed decades of peacetime development into just a few frantic years. It did what wars so often do to technology. It made the theoretically interesting suddenly desperately urgent. Let's start with the most secret part of the story, because it's also the most dramatic. Bletchley Park, a Victorian manor house and estate about 50 miles northwest of London, quietly requisitioned by the British government in 1938 as the wartime headquarters of the Government Code and Cipher School. This is where Britain's codebreakers worked, in conditions of absolute secrecy, many of them billeted in nearby villages, forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, even their spouses, to crack the encrypted military communications of Nazi Germany. And the most important target was Enigma. You've probably heard of the Enigma machine. It was an encryption device that looked like a typewriter in a wooden box. You typed a letter on the keyboard, and electrical current flowed through a set of rotating wheels called rotors. Each rotor had internal wiring that scrambled the signal in a different way, and through a plug board on the front that swapped pairs of letters. An encrypted letter lit up on a lamp panel on top. The rotors advanced with each keystroke, so the same plain text letter would encrypt to a different ciphertext letter each time you pressed it. The number of possible configurations was astronomical, depending on the version and how many rotors and plugboard connections were used, on the order of 158 million possible settings. The Germans were confident Enigma was unbreakable. They were wrong, and the person most responsible for breaking it was Alan Turing. We need to talk about Turing carefully and at some length, because he is not just a major character in this story. He is the central figure. By any reasonable measure, Alan Matheson Turing is the single most important person in the entire history of computing. His contributions spanned the purely theoretical and the urgently practical, which is an almost impossibly rare combination. Most great thinkers are good at abstraction or at engineering. Turing was both, at the very highest level, in the same lifetime. Turing was born in London on June 23, 1912. His father was a civil servant in the Indian Civil Service, and Turing spent much of his childhood in foster care in England while his parents were abroad. He was a solitary, eccentric child, brilliant in mathematics and science, indifferent to most other subjects, socially awkward in that way that brilliant children often are. At the Sherborne School, he reportedly cycled 60 miles to attend his first day of classes when a general strike shut down the trains. He was not a natural fit for the rigid conventions of an English boarding school, but his mathematical ability was unmistakable. In 1936, at the age of 23, Turing published one of the most important papers in the history of mathematics, on computable numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem. The Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem, was a question posed by the great German mathematician David Hilbert. Is there a mechanical procedure, an algorithm, a step-by-step process that could determine, for any given mathematical statement, whether that statement is provable? Hilbert, an optimist about the power of mathematical formalism, believed the answer was yes. Turing proved him wrong. But here's what's remarkable. To prove Hilbert wrong, Turing first had to define precisely what a mechanical procedure even means, and to do that, he invented an imaginary machine. A breathtakingly simple imaginary machine. It has an infinitely long tape divided into cells, each containing a symbol, say a 0 or a 1 or a blank. It has a read-write head that sits over one cell at a time and can read the symbol there, erase it and write a new symbol, and then move one cell to the left or one cell to the right. And it has a finite set of rules, a table of instructions that tell it what to do based on two things: its current internal state and the symbol it's currently reading. If you're in state A and you see a 1, write a 0, move right, and switch to state B. That's the kind of rule. Tape, head, rules. Nothing else. This absurdly simple machine, the Turing machine, as it came to be known, turned out to be capable of computing anything that is computable, anything at all, any calculation that any computer, no matter how powerful, no matter how futuristic, can perform. A Turing machine can also perform, given enough time and enough tape. This result, known as the Church-Turing thesis, is one of the deep truths of mathematics and computer science. There is a ceiling to what computation can do, and the simple Turing machine is already at that ceiling. And Turing showed something even more remarkable. You could design a universal Turing machine, a single machine whose rules tell it how to read the description of any other Turing machine from its tape and simulate that machine's behavior. You feed it a description of another machine plus that machine's input, and it produces the same output. One machine that can imitate any other machine. One machine that can run any program. That is the idea of a general-purpose computer. That is why you can use the same laptop to write a novel, play a video game, edit a photograph, and calculate your taxes. It's a universal Turing machine. Its behavior is determined not by its physical hardware, but by the software you load into it. Turing described this concept clearly, precisely, with full mathematical rigor in 1936, before any electronic computer existed on Earth. But in September 1939, Turing put the abstract mathematics aside and went to war. He arrived at Bletchley Park the day after Britain declared war on Germany and was put to work on Enigma. Now, crucially, Turing wasn't starting from scratch. The Polish Cipher Bureau had already made stunning breakthroughs. 3 young Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, had figured out the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors through brilliant mathematical analysis, and they had built electromechanical devices, called bombas, that could help find Enigma's daily settings. Just weeks before Poland was invaded in September 1939, they shared everything they knew with the British and French intelligence services in a remarkable act of Allied cooperation that was crucial to everything that followed. Turing built on this foundation, but with characteristic originality. His approach was substantially different from the Polish one. He designed a machine called the bomb. The British bomb was an electromechanical device about 6.5 feet tall, 7 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, containing the equivalent of 36 Enigma machines wired together in a configuration that allowed it to test possible settings at high speed. It worked by exploiting known or guessed fragments of plaintext, called cribs. If the code breakers could guess that a particular intercepted message probably contained a certain phrase, weather report was a common one, since the German military sent weather reports in the same format every day. The bomb could use that guess to eliminate impossible Enigma configurations at great speed, narrowing billions of possibilities down to a manageable handful that could be tested by hand. By mid-1940, the bomb bays were running at Bletchley Park, and the intelligence they produced, codenamed Ultra, was flowing to Allied commanders. The impact was enormous and is difficult to overstate. Ultra intelligence played a critical role in the Battle of the Atlantic, helping the Royal Navy locate and sink German U-boats that were strangling Britain's supply lines across the ocean. It provided advance warning of German military operations in North Africa, enabling Allied victories at crucial moments. It contributed significantly to the planning of the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Historians debate exactly how much Ultra shortened the war. Estimates range from 1 year to perhaps 3. But its contribution to the Allied victory is not seriously disputed by anyone who has studied the evidence. But Bletchley Park produced something even more significant for the history of computing, and it came from a different cryptographic challenge: the Lorenz cipher. While Enigma was used by the German Army and Air Force for tactical communications in the field, the German High Command, Hitler's generals, strategic-level communications, used a more sophisticated encryption system for their most sensitive messages. This system used a machine called the Lorenz SZ40/42, which was significantly more complex than Enigma and much harder to break. The effort to crack the Lorenz cipher led to the creation of a machine called Colossus, and Colossus was, by any reasonable definition, the world's first large-scale electronic digital computer. Its designer was Tommy Flowers, a brilliant engineer from the General Post Office research labs at Dollis Hill in North London. Flowers had spent years working with telephone switching equipment and had become expert in the use of vacuum tubes, thermionic valves, as the British called them. Most engineers at Bletchley Park and elsewhere believed that a machine with hundreds or thousands of vacuum tubes would be hopelessly unreliable. Tubes burned out. They were fragile. They were temperamental. A machine with 1,000 of them would spend more time being repaired than running. Flowers disagreed, based on his practical experience. He believed that most tube failures happened when you switched the machine on, because the sudden inrush of current stressed the components. His solution was simple and elegant. Never switch the machine off. Leave it running continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The tubes, once warmed up and stabilized, would last for a very long time. Colossus Mark I went operational at Bletchley Park in February 1944, containing 1,500 vacuum tubes. It could read paper tape at 5,000 characters per second. The tape whizzed through the machine so fast that it made a distinctive screaming sound. The Mark II, which arrived in June 1944, just in time for the D-Day landings, used 2,400 tubes and was 5 times faster. By the end of the war, 10 Colossus machines were running at Bletchley Park, and the intelligence they produced was of extraordinary strategic value. And then came the tragedy. After the war, the British government classified everything about Colossus. Everything. The machines were dismantled. Most of the engineering drawings were destroyed on Winston Churchill's orders. The people who had built and operated them were sworn to absolute secrecy, some for over 30 years. Tommy Flowers received a modest award of £1,000 for his contribution to the war effort, which didn't even cover the personal money he'd spent on the project. When he approached the Bank of England after the war with a proposal to build electronic computing systems for financial calculations, they asked him for proof that such a thing was feasible. He couldn't provide it. The proof was classified. He couldn't tell them what he'd built or what it could do. For decades, the pioneers of Colossus watched in silence as American computer builders received credit for achievements they themselves had accomplished years earlier, in secret, under wartime pressure. It's one of the great injustices in the history of technology. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the computing project that would become famous was under construction, partly because, unlike Colossus, it wasn't classified. ENIAC, the electronic numerical integrator and computer. Built at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering by John Mauchly and J. Presper Eckert, funded by the U.S. Army, and designed to calculate artillery firing tables, those dense reference books that told gunners what angle to set their cannons at for any given combination of range, wind speed, elevation, and temperature. Each table entry required a complex ballistic trajectory calculation, and computing them by hand using teams of human calculators, mostly women, and this is an important and too often overlooked part of the story. Hundreds of women with mathematics degrees doing laborious calculations by hand and with desk calculators was painfully slow. ENIAC was enormous. It used 17,468 vacuum tubes. It contained 70,000 resistors, 10,000 capacitors, and 6,000 switches. It weighed 30 tons. It occupied a U-shaped room 1,500 square feet in size, and when you stood inside it, you were literally surrounded by walls of electronics, racks of tubes stretching above your head, cables snaking everywhere, the whole thing humming and clicking and radiating heat like a furnace. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, so much that there's a persistent legend, possibly apocryphal but widely told, that when ENIAC was switched on, the lights dimmed in an entire section of Philadelphia, and it was fast, 5,000 additions per second, 1,000 times faster than any electromechanical calculator. A trajectory calculation that took a human computer 20 hours, a full working day and then some, could be done by ENIAC in 30 seconds. And here's something that often gets left out of the ENIAC story, and shouldn't be. The people who actually programmed ENIAC, who figured out how to set it up to solve specific problems, were 6 women: Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlon Westcott, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman. They had been hired as human computers, part of a large team of women with mathematics degrees who calculated firing tables by hand. When ENIAC was built, they were selected to learn the machine and figure out how to make it work. And this was not a trivial task. ENIAC didn't have a programming language. It didn't have a stored program. Programming it meant physically configuring the machine, setting thousands of switches, plugging and unplugging cables that routed data between ENIAC's different units. To program a new problem, you had to understand the machine's architecture intimately, break the mathematical problem down into a sequence of operations the hardware could execute, and then physically wire those operations into the machine, a process that could take days or even weeks. These women, essentially, invented the job of programming as we know it. They figured out how to translate mathematical procedures into machine operations. They debugged hardware by crawling through the machine, looking for burned-out tubes and loose connections. They developed techniques for verifying results and handling errors. And yet, for decades, their contributions were almost completely unrecognized. In the famous photographs of ENIAC's unveiling to the press in 1946, several of the women programmers are visible in the background, but for years, they were identified only as models or assistants, if they were identified at all. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when historians like Kathy Kleiman began researching the story, that the ENIAC women received proper credit for their pioneering work. Betty Holberton, Betty Snyder's married name, went on to help develop UNIVAC and made major contributions to the development of programming languages, including work on COBOL and Fortran. Their story is a powerful reminder that computing history has always been more diverse than the standard narrative suggests, and that some of its most important contributors were invisible for far too long. ENIAC was completed in late 1945, just after the war ended, too late for its original purpose of computing firing tables, but it was immediately put to work on other problems, including enormously complex calculations for the development of the hydrogen bomb, and it received extraordinary publicity. The press called it a giant brain. Newspapers ran breathless stories about its capabilities. The public was fascinated and a little frightened. The age of electronic computing had arrived, and this time, unlike the secret world of Colossus, everyone knew about it. But ENIAC had a significant practical limitation that became increasingly frustrating as people wanted to use it for different kinds of problems. It was programmed by physically rewiring the machine, rearranging cables and setting switches, a process that could take days or even weeks for a complex problem. While the machine itself could calculate at blazing speed, changing what it calculated required essentially rebuilding its internal connections. This was not, in any real sense, software. It was hardware reconfiguration. And this limitation points us directly to the crucial idea that separates ENIAC-style machines from true modern computers: the stored program concept. The stored program concept is the idea that the instructions, the program, should be stored in the same memory as the data, so the computer can read its instructions from memory, execute them in sequence, and switch from one program to another simply by loading different instructions. No rewiring, no physical reconfiguration, just change the contents of memory. This idea is usually associated with John von Neumann, the Hungarian-American mathematician who was, without exaggeration, one of the 3 or 4 most brilliantly versatile minds of the 20th century. Von Neumann made major contributions to quantum mechanics, game theory, nuclear weapons design, cellular automata, and mathematical economics, among other fields. When he turned his attention to computing in the mid-1940s, the results were characteristically transformative. In 1945, von Neumann wrote a document that became known as the first draft of a report on the EDVAC, EDVAC being the planned successor to ENIAC. In this report, he laid out the architecture of a stored program computer with crystal clarity, a processing unit that performs arithmetic and logical operations, a memory that holds both data and instructions, an input-output system, a control unit that fetches instructions from memory and executes them one by one. This design, the von Neumann architecture, is still the fundamental blueprint for virtually every conventional computer in use today. Now, there's an important caveat. The stored program idea wasn't solely von Neumann's. Turing had described something mathematically equivalent, the universal Turing machine, back in 1936. And Eckert and Mauchly at the Moore School had been discussing stored program designs before von Neumann got involved. The question of who deserves credit became a bitter, decades-long controversy, made worse by the fact that von Neumann's name was the only one on the report, even though it described ideas that had emerged from collaborative discussions. The politics of credit in computing history are messy, but the concept itself was the breakthrough, regardless of who gets the naming rights. The first computers to actually run stored programs came online in the late 1940s. The Manchester Baby, officially the small-scale experimental machine, built by Frederick Williams and Tom Kilburn at the University of Manchester, executed the first stored program on June 21, 1948. The program was mathematically modest, finding the highest proper divisor of a number by trying every possibility. But the achievement was monumental. A machine reading its own instructions from memory, executing them in sequence, making decisions, looping back. It ran for 52 minutes and produced the correct answer. The EDSAC, built by Maurice Wilkes at Cambridge, followed in May 1949 and was the first practical stored program computer, immediately put to work on real scientific calculations, including a problem in number theory that produced results published in a scientific journal. In the U.S., the EDVAC became operational at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and the IAS machine at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, built under von Neumann's direction, began operation in 1952. And then something crucial happened that often gets overlooked. Once you had stored program computers, machines that could read and execute any sequence of instructions stored in memory, the question became, how do you write those instructions? The earliest programs were written in machine code, raw binary numbers, strings of ones and zeros that the hardware could execute directly. This was extraordinarily tedious and error-prone. A programmer had to know the numerical code for every operation. What number means add? What number means store this in memory location 47? What number means jump to instruction 215 if the result is 0? It was like writing poetry, using nothing but a numbered list of every word in the dictionary. The first step up was assembly language, which replaced the raw numbers with short mnemonic codes, ADD, instead of whatever binary number meant add, MOV for move, JMP for jump. This was easier for humans to read and write, but it was still extremely low level. You had to think in terms of individual machine operations, one at a time. Writing a complex program in assembly was like building a house one brick at a time, with no blueprints. You had to keep the entire structure in your head. The next great leap was the high-level programming language. Instead of telling the machine what to do in its own language, you could write instructions in something closer to human language, or at least human mathematical notation, and a special program called a compiler would translate those instructions into the machine code the hardware actually understood. Fortran, formula translation, was developed by John Backus and his team at IBM in the mid-1950s and released in 1957. It was designed for scientific and engineering calculations, and it was revolutionary. A calculation that might take dozens of lines of assembly language could be expressed in a single Fortran statement. COBOL, Common Business-Oriented Language, followed in 1959, designed for business data processing and largely shaped by the work of Grace Hopper, a U.S. Navy Rear Admiral and computer scientist who had been one of the pioneers of automatic programming. Hopper, incidentally, is also credited with popularizing the term bug for a computer error, after a moth was found trapped in a relay of the Harvard Mark II computer in 1947, causing a malfunction. The actual moth was taped into the logbook, which is now in the Smithsonian. The development of high-level programming languages was, in its way, as important as the hardware advances. It multiplied the number of people who could write software by orders of magnitude. You no longer needed to understand the intimate details of a specific machine's architecture to program it. You could think at a higher level of abstraction about the problem you were solving, rather than the mechanics of the hardware. And that abstraction is what allowed computing to grow from a handful of specialists operating room-sized machines to an entire industry of millions of programmers building the software that runs the modern world. But even with better programming languages, the vacuum tubes had to go. They were too large, too hot, too power-hungry, too unreliable. ENIAC's 17,000 tubes burned out at a rate that required near-constant maintenance. And their replacement was already being born in one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century. Bell Telephone Laboratories, Murray Hill, New Jersey, December 16, 1947. 3 physicists, William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, demonstrated the first working transistor. A transistor does what a vacuum tube does. It acts as a switch, controlling the flow of electrical current. But instead of a heated filament in a glass envelope, controlling electrons flowing through a vacuum, a transistor uses a tiny piece of semiconductor material, usually silicon, to control electrons flowing through a solid. No vacuum, no filament, no glass, just a sliver of crystal. The advantages were profound. Transistors were smaller, vastly smaller. A vacuum tube was typically several inches tall and required a socket, a heater supply, and significant clearance around it for heat dissipation. A transistor could be the size of a pencil eraser, and it would keep shrinking. They used a fraction of the power. No heater filament consuming watts, just to get the tube ready to work. They generated far less heat, which meant you could pack them closer together without everything melting. They were more reliable, orders of magnitude more reliable, because there was no filament to burn out, no vacuum seal to crack, no glass envelope to shatter. They were faster, because electrons move through a solid semiconductor much more efficiently than through a vacuum in a glass tube. And perhaps most importantly, they could be manufactured using chemical and photographic processes, etching patterns onto silicon wafers, using techniques borrowed from the printing industry, rather than the skilled hand assembly required for vacuum tubes. This meant mass production. It meant scale. It meant cheap. The transistor didn't conquer computing overnight. Early transistors were finicky and expensive, and it took years to develop manufacturing processes that were reliable enough for commercial production. The first transistor radio, the Regency TR-1, didn't appear until Christmas 1954. The first fully transistorized computer, the Manchester Transistor Computer, ran in 1953 as an experimental machine. IBM didn't ship a fully transistorized commercial mainframe until the 7090 in 1959, but the trajectory was unmistakable. By the early 1960s, vacuum tubes were obsolete for computing, and the transistor reigned supreme. Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956 for the transistor, a recognition of just how foundational their invention was. But the personal dynamics among them were poisonous. Shockley, who was nominally in charge of the research group but had not been present for the key breakthrough, Bardeen and Brattain had made the critical discovery while Shockley was away, felt that he had been unfairly overshadowed. He responded by developing the junction transistor, an improved design, largely on his own, making sure his name was prominently attached. His relationship with Bardeen and Brattain deteriorated beyond repair. Bardeen eventually left Bell Labs for the University of Illinois, where he went on to win a second Nobel Prize for the theory of superconductivity, becoming the only person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes in physics. Shockley left Bell Labs in 1956 and moved to California to start his own company, Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View. He chose California partly to be near his aging mother, and partly because Stanford University offered a convenient pool of talented engineers. He recruited a team of brilliant young physicists and engineers, the best he could find, and then he proceeded to make them all miserable. Shockley was a manager of legendary awfulness. He was paranoid, arbitrary, and autocratic. He demanded loyalty tests. He ordered his employees to take lie detector examinations, when he suspected someone had scratched his office door. Within 2 years, 8 of his top researchers, later immortalized as the traitorous 8, had had enough. They resigned en masse in 1957 and, with backing from the Fairchild Camera and Instrument Corporation, founded Fairchild Semiconductor. It's hard to overstate the significance of this act of corporate rebellion. Fairchild Semiconductor became the incubator for the entire modern semiconductor industry. Over the following decade, dozens of engineers left Fairchild to start their own companies, a diaspora so prolific that the companies spawned from it were called Fairchildren. The most important of these was Intel, founded in 1968 by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, 2 of the original traitorous 8. The region around Mountain View and Palo Alto filled up with semiconductor companies, venture capital firms, and electronics startups, all feeding on each other's talent and ideas. That region became known as Silicon Valley, and it all traces back, through a chain of feuds and departures, to William Shockley's decision to move to California and his spectacular inability to manage people. But the transistor, revolutionary as it was just the beginning. The real revolution was the integrated circuit, the idea of putting not just one transistor, but an entire circuit, with all its components and connections, on a single chip of semiconductor material. The problem that drove this innovation was called the tyranny of numbers. By the late 1950s, engineers could design circuits of extraordinary complexity, but building them was a nightmare. Every component, every transistor, resistor, capacitor, was a separate physical object that had to be individually manufactured, tested, and then connected to the others by hand-soldered wires. As circuits grew more complex, the number of individual components and solder joints grew astronomically, and so did the cost, the size, the weight, and the probability of failure. The wiring itself became the bottleneck. The solution came from 2 men, working independently, almost simultaneously. Jack Kilby, a tall, quiet, self-effacing engineer from Great Bend, Kansas, working at Texas Instruments in Dallas, and Robert Noyce, the charismatic, risk-taking co-founder of Fairchild Semiconductor in California. In the summer of 1958, Kilby, a new hire at TI who didn't have enough seniority to take the mandatory company-wide vacation, found himself nearly alone in the lab for 2 weeks. And in that solitude, he had his insight. Transistors are made of semiconductor material, but resistors can also be made of semiconductor material, if you shape and dope the silicon the right way, and so can capacitors. What if you made every component out of the same piece of semiconductor? No separate parts, no wires. Everything integrated on one chip. Kilby demonstrated his idea on September 12, 1958, a crude oscillator circuit made on a sliver of germanium, with connections made by hand-bonded gold wires. It was rough, but it worked. 6 months later, Robert Noyce arrived at essentially the same idea, but with a crucial practical improvement. Noyce proposed using a planar manufacturing process, building up the circuit in flat layers on a silicon wafer, using photographic masks and chemical etching, with aluminum interconnections deposited on top. Everything flat, everything manufacturable, using processes that could scale to mass production. Noyce's approach is the one the industry adopted. Both men are recognized as co-inventors of the integrated circuit. Kilby received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2000. Noyce died in 1990. Too early for that recognition. Nobel Prizes are not awarded posthumously. Their shared invention is arguably the most economically significant technological innovation of the 20th century, and the integrated circuit brought with it something almost uncanny. In 1965, Gordon Moore, Noyce's co-founder at Intel, published an observation that the number of transistors on a chip had been doubling roughly every year, and predicted this would continue. He later revised the doubling time to about every 2 years. Moore's law, as it became known, held remarkably true for over 50 years. Its implications were staggering. Exponential growth. What fills a room today fits in your pocket in 20 years. What costs $1 million now costs pennies in a decade. In 1971, Intel released the 4004, the first commercial microprocessor, a complete CPU on a single chip with 2,300 transistors. It was designed for a Japanese calculator company, but Intel saw its broader potential. The 4004 led to the 8008, the 8080, and eventually the 8086, the ancestor of the x86 architecture that still powers most personal computers today. And with microprocessors came the possibility that had seemed absurd just a decade earlier: a computer for everyone. The personal computer revolution is one of those stories that feels almost mythological now, but the remarkable thing is that it really happened the way the myths say it did: in garages, in basements, in hobbyist clubs, driven by young people who saw a future that the established computer industry not only couldn't see, but actively dismissed. The spark was the Altair 8800, which appeared on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine in January 1975. It was designed by Ed Roberts and his tiny company, MITS, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Roberts was nearly bankrupt and was hoping to sell maybe a few hundred kits to electronics hobbyists. The Altair was, by any modern standard, absurdly primitive. It was a metal box with rows of toggle switches on the front panel and a row of small red LEDs. It had no keyboard, no screen, no permanent storage of any kind. It had 256 bytes of memory, not megabytes, not kilobytes, bytes, 256 of them. You programmed it by flipping switches to enter machine code 1 byte at a time, and the output was a pattern of blinking lights that you had to interpret yourself. And yet, Popular Electronics sold out its entire print run. MITS was flooded with thousands of orders. People didn't care that the Altair could barely do anything. They cared that it was a computer, and they could own one, and they could learn how it worked from the inside out. The idea of personal computing, a computer that belonged to you, that you controlled, that you could program to do whatever you wanted, was intoxicating. The Altair ignited the hobby computer movement. Computer clubs sprang up across the country. The most famous was the Homebrew Computer Club, which started meeting in a garage in Menlo Park, California, in March 1975. It was a motley collection: hardware hackers, electronics hobbyists, counterculture idealists, who saw computing as a tool of personal liberation, and serious engineers from nearby companies. The ethos was one of openness and sharing. People brought their projects, showed what they'd built, traded tips and components. And among the regulars were 2 young men who would change the world. Steve Wozniak was the engineer, a shy, self-effacing genius of hardware design who loved building things for the pure joy of elegant engineering. He worked at Hewlett-Packard during the day and tinkered with computers at night. When he saw the Altair, he knew he could do something much better. He designed a computer, the Apple I, that was dramatically more integrated and user-friendly than anything else available. It used a keyboard for input and could display text on a television screen. No toggle switches, no front panel lights. You could type commands and see the results in readable text. Wozniak brought his creation to the Homebrew Computer Club, and people were genuinely impressed. Steve Jobs was the other half of the equation, not an engineer, but a visionary and a hustler, someone who understood the commercial potential of Wozniak's engineering in a way that Wozniak himself did not. Jobs convinced Wozniak to start a company. They scraped together $1,300, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sold his beloved HP 65 calculator and founded Apple Computer Company on April 1, 1976, in the Jobs family garage in Los Altos, California. The Apple I was a modest success, about 200 units sold, mostly to hobbyists. But the Apple II, released in 1977, was a genuine sensation and one of the most important products in the history of computing. It came in a sleek, friendly plastic case, designed to look like a home appliance rather than a piece of laboratory equipment. It had a built-in keyboard, color graphics, sound, game paddles, and expansion slots for adding peripherals. It could connect to a standard television, and it shipped with a version of BASIC, so anyone could start writing programs right away. When VisiCalc, the first electronic spreadsheet, was released for the Apple II in 1979, it gave businesses a reason to buy a personal computer. Accountants and financial analysts suddenly had a tool that let them play "what if" with their numbers, changing one assumption and watching the entire spreadsheet recalculate instantly. Some people have argued, not unreasonably, that VisiCalc did more to sell personal computers than any other single piece of software in history. But it was IBM's entry into the market that truly transformed the industry. When IBM, Big Blue, the most powerful and respected name in computing, the company that sold room-sized mainframes to corporations and governments, decided to build a personal computer, the corporate world sat up and paid attention. There was a famous saying in corporate IT departments: nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. The IBM PC, released on August 12, 1981, wasn't the most innovative personal computer on the market. It wasn't the cheapest, but it had the IBM name on it, and that name meant trust, reliability, and safety. Corporations started buying PCs by the thousands, but IBM made a decision that would have consequences far beyond anything they imagined. Under pressure to get the product to market quickly, they built it almost entirely from off-the-shelf components. The processor was Intel's 8088. The operating system was licensed from a small Seattle company called Microsoft, run by a young man named Bill Gates, who had the extraordinary foresight to license DOS to IBM on a non-exclusive basis, meaning Microsoft was free to sell the same operating system to other manufacturers, and IBM published the technical specifications of the PC openly. This meant that other manufacturers could build IBM-compatible computers, clones, using the same Intel processors and the same Microsoft operating system, and they did. Compaq, Dell, Gateway, HP, and dozens of others flooded the market with compatible machines, often cheaper than IBM's own products, and sometimes better. IBM had inadvertently created an open standard and then lost control of it. The real winners were Intel, which supplied the processors, and Microsoft, which supplied the operating system. The Wintel duopoly, Windows plus Intel, would dominate personal computing for the next 2 decades. Meanwhile, the graphical user interface, the way most people interact with computers today, was developed at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, in the early 1970s. Researchers there built a computer, called the Alto, that used windows, icons, menus, and a mouse pointer, the WIMP paradigm, as it was sometimes called. Instead of typing commands at a blinking cursor, you pointed at things on the screen and clicked. Documents appeared on screen, looking roughly the way they would look when printed, what they called WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. It was intuitive, visual, and friendly. And Xerox, in one of the great missed opportunities of business history, failed to turn it into a commercial product. In 1979, Steve Jobs negotiated a visit to Xerox PARC and saw a demonstration of the graphical interface. He was thunderstruck. He immediately understood its potential and redirected Apple's engineering resources to build a computer around the concept. Apple's first attempt, the Lisa, was too expensive at nearly $10,000 and flopped commercially. But the second attempt, the Macintosh, released on January 24, 1984, announced with a legendary Super Bowl commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, was a landmark. The Mac wasn't the first computer with a GUI, but it was the first affordable, mass-market personal computer that made the graphical interface the default way of using the machine. It influenced everything that came after. Microsoft, not wanting to be left behind, released Windows. Windows 1.0 in 1985 was crude. Windows 2.0 and 3.0 improved steadily. But it was Windows 95, released in August 1995, with a marketing blitz that included licensing the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up, that brought the graphical interface to the vast world of IBM-compatible PCs. By the late 1990s, the point-and-click, drag-and-drop graphical interface was simply how people used computers. The command line didn't disappear. Programmers and system administrators still use it every day. But for most people, the computer had become a visual, intuitive, approachable thing. And that accessibility opened computing to hundreds of millions of people who would never have learned to type DOS commands. Now, while the personal computer was transforming offices and living rooms, something even more transformative was growing quietly in the background: the Internet. And the Internet's origin story is one of the most important tales in all of technology. ARPANET, funded by the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency, went live on October 29, 1969, connecting 4 nodes: UCLA, the Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. The very first message was supposed to be the word login. The UCLA programmer, Charlie Klein, typed the L and the O, and the system crashed. The first word ever transmitted over what would become the Internet was low, which, if you think about it, is kind of perfect. Even the Internet's first breath was a glitch. ARPANET grew through the 1970s, connecting universities and research labs across the country. But it was just one network among many. SysNet, BitNet, Usenet, and various European networks all operated independently, using incompatible protocols. The breakthrough that turned these separate networks into one Internet was TCP/IP, Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol, developed by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. TCP breaks data into packets and ensures they arrive correctly. IP handles addressing and routing. Together, they provided a common language that let any network talk to any other network. ARPANET adopted TCP/IP on January 1, 1983, a date sometimes called the birthday of the Internet. But the Internet of the 1980s was still a specialist tool, text-based, command-line-driven, used mostly by academics and researchers who knew how to navigate its arcane commands. What transformed it into a mass phenomenon was the World Wide Web, invented in 1989 by Tim Berners-Lee, a British physicist working at CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland. Berners-Lee's problem was practical. CERN was a sprawling international research lab with thousands of scientists using different computers, different operating systems, different data formats. Finding information was a nightmare. Berners-Lee proposed a system of interlinked documents, hypertext, where you could click on a highlighted word in one document and jump instantly to a related document somewhere else, on a completely different computer, in a completely different country. He combined 3 technologies: HTML, a simple markup language for formatting documents with embedded links; HTTP, a protocol for requesting and transmitting those documents; and URLs, a universal addressing system, so every document on every server in the world had a unique, findable location. He built the first web browser and the first web server on a Next computer in his office at CERN. And then he did something extraordinary. He gave it away. CERN released the World Wide Web technology into the public domain in April 1993, free for anyone to use, modify, and build upon. Berners-Lee could have patented it. He could have started a company and charged licensing fees. He could have become one of the wealthiest people in the world. He chose not to. He understood, and this showed remarkable foresight, that the web's value would grow in proportion to the number of people using it, and that charging for access would strangle that growth in its cradle. It was one of the most consequential acts of generosity in the history of technology. The web exploded. The Mosaic browser in 1993 made it graphical and accessible. Netscape Navigator in 1994 brought it to millions of mainstream users. Amazon launched in 1994 as an online bookstore. Yahoo in 1995. Google in 1998, with a search algorithm that was so much better than the competition that it quickly became the default way to find things online. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s poured billions of dollars of venture capital into internet startups, many of which had no viable business model and eventually collapsed when the bubble burst in 2000. Pets.com, Webvan, Boo.com. The wreckage was spectacular. Trillions of dollars of stock market value evaporated. But the crash killed the speculation without killing the technology. The infrastructure built during the boom, fiber optic cables, data centers, network equipment, was still there and still getting better. The companies that survived, Amazon, Google, eBay, had real business models. And in the years after the crash, a new wave of innovation emerged. Social media, Friendster, MySpace, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, gave everyone a voice and a platform, for better and worse. Cloud computing, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, let anyone rent computing power on demand, eliminating the need to buy and maintain expensive hardware. And then came the device that changed everything. Apple's iPhone, launched on June 29, 2007, was arguably the most significant consumer electronics product since the personal computer itself. It wasn't the first smartphone. BlackBerry, Palm, and Nokia had been making smartphones for years, but the iPhone was the first that felt like the future. The capacitive multi-touch screen that responded to your fingers with fluid, natural gestures. The elegant, intuitive interface that made complex operations feel simple. The App Store, launched in 2008, that created an entire ecosystem of software developers building tools, games, and services for the device. The iPhone made the internet something you carried with you everywhere, all the time. Not a destination you traveled to by sitting down at a desk, but a constant companion in your pocket. Google's Android, launched in 2008 on a variety of hardware from different manufacturers, brought the same fundamental concept to a much wider range of devices at a much wider range of price points. By the mid-2010s, there were more smartphones in the world than people. Computing had become truly, irreversibly ubiquitous. Billions of people who had never owned a desktop computer or a laptop, people in rural India, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asian villages, were suddenly online, connected, carrying in their hand more computing power than the Apollo program had available to put astronauts on the moon. More computing power than existed in the entire world in 1960. And the story keeps accelerating, faster now than at any point in the past. Cloud computing lets startups access supercomputer-level infrastructure with nothing more than a credit card, eliminating the enormous capital costs that had once made computing a rich company's game. A couple of engineers in a coffee shop could spin up more computing power than a Fortune 500 company possessed in the 1990s, use it for an hour, and then shut it down, paying only for what they consumed. The barriers to entry for building technology companies dropped to nearly zero, and the result was an explosion of innovation. Ride-sharing apps, streaming services, social platforms, financial technology, online education, telehealth, that transformed industry after industry. Big data, the oceanic volumes of information generated by billions of connected people and devices, created entirely new possibilities and entirely new anxieties. Companies could analyze purchasing patterns, health metrics, social interactions, and location data at scales that revealed insights invisible to the human eye. But the same capabilities raised urgent questions about privacy, surveillance, and consent. Who owns your data? Who can access it? What decisions are being made about you by algorithms you can't see, based on information you may not even know has been collected? These questions became some of the most consequential political and ethical issues of the early 21st century, and they remain largely unresolved. And then there was artificial intelligence, the dream that goes all the way back to Babbage and Lovelace, to Turing and his question about whether machines can think. That dream, after decades of progress and setback and false dawn and slow, steady advance, suddenly exploded into the mainstream. The modern AI revolution is built on neural networks, computing architectures loosely inspired by the interconnected neurons of the human brain. The basic ideas go back decades. Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts proposed a mathematical model of neural activity in 1943, and Frank Rosenblatt built the perceptron, a simple learning machine, in 1958. But for most of the 20th century, neural networks were a backwater of computer science. The algorithms existed, but the computing power to train large networks didn't, and the available data wasn't sufficient to teach them anything useful. What changed, around 2012, was the convergence of three things: vastly more data, thanks to the internet and smartphones generating torrents of text, images, and video; vastly more computing power, particularly from GPUs, graphics processing units, originally designed for video games, which turned out to be perfectly suited for the massively parallel matrix operations that neural networks require, and algorithmic breakthroughs in training deep networks with many layers. A team from the University of Toronto, Jeffrey Hinton, Ilya Sutskever, and Alex Krzyzewski, entered the ImageNet competition in 2012 with a deep convolutional neural network called AlexNet and demolished the competition. Their error rate was nearly half that of the next best system. Deep learning worked. It worked spectacularly, and the floodgates opened. Within a few years, deep learning was achieving superhuman performance on task after task: image recognition, speech recognition, language translation, game playing. In 2016, Google DeepMind's AlphaGo defeated Lee Sedol, one of the world's best Go players, in a 5-game match. A milestone many experts had predicted was still a decade away. And then came the large language models, systems trained on enormous quantities of text from the internet, learning the statistical patterns of human language at a scale and depth that produced results no one had quite anticipated. GPT-3 in 2020. ChatGPT in November 2022, which reached 100 million users in 2 months, the fastest adoption of any technology product in history. Claude, Gemini, Llama, and others following rapidly. Systems that could write functional code, pass professional examinations, generate photorealistic images from text descriptions, hold extended conversations on virtually any topic. All of it resting on the same foundation of switches and Boolean logic and stored programs and integrated circuits, that we've been tracing all night. And now here you are, lying in the dark, and the room around you is full of computing. The chips in your phone, each containing billions of transistors, descendants of Kilby and Noyce's invention, manufactured in fabrication plants, so clean that a single speck of dust could ruin a chip, using processes so precise they work at scales measured in nanometers, billionths of a meter. The Wi-Fi signals passing through your walls, encoded using principles from Claude Shannon's information theory. The cellular network routing your data through protocols descended from ARPANET. Every one of these things has a lineage we've traced tonight, a chain of ideas and inventions and human stubbornness stretching back centuries and millennia. Here's what I find most remarkable about all of it. At every single stage of this story, the breakthroughs happened because someone saw possibility, where everyone else saw impossibility. Babbage saw a computer in an age of gears. Lovelace saw universal symbol manipulation when the machine didn't even exist. Boole saw the algebra of thought when logic was still philosophy. Shannon saw Boolean circuits when everyone else just saw telephone relays. Turing saw a universal machine when all he had was a thought experiment and an infinite imaginary tape. Flowers saw a working electronic computer when everyone told him vacuum tubes couldn't be trusted. Kilby and Noyce saw the integrated circuit when the industry was drowning in the tyranny of numbers. Wozniak and Jobs saw a personal computer when the establishment thought the idea was ridiculous. Berners-Lee saw the World Wide Web and gave it away for free because he understood that its value would only grow if everyone could use it. That's the real story of computing, not just switches and circuits and chips, as important as those are. It's the human capacity to look at the world and imagine it different, to see a problem and refuse to accept that it can't be solved, to spend a career, sometimes a lifetime, on an idea that might never work, because it should work, because it deserves to exist. Babbage died without seeing his engine built, and 120 years later, engineers built it from his plans, and it worked perfectly. Turing was prosecuted for his homosexuality, chemically castrated, and driven to his death at 41 by the very society he'd helped save. And 80 years later, every device on Earth runs on his ideas, and his face is on the British 50-pound note. Flowers was silenced by official secrecy, his achievement unrecognized for decades. And when the truth finally emerged, historians recognized him as one of the true pioneers. The arc of this story bends toward vindication, eventually. The ideas survive. The machines get built. The dreamers, in the end, are proven right. So as you lie there, feeling the weight of the blankets, letting your breathing slow down, here's maybe the most remarkable thing about all of it. The device on your nightstand, the one you'll probably reach for in the morning, contains within it the dreams and labors of thousands of people stretching back across centuries. Babbage's architecture is in there, the mill and the store, reimagined in silicon. Boole's logic gates are in there, billions of them, computing and or and not millions of times per second. Shannon's insight about switches and Boolean algebra is in there. It's the reason the whole thing works at all. Turing's universal machine is in there, the idea that one device can run any program, do anything computable. Von Neumann's stored program is in there, the instructions and the data, sitting side by side in memory, the program reading itself. Kilby and Noyce's integrated circuits are in there, an entire world of complexity, on a chip the size of a postage stamp. And now, even a kind of intelligence is in there. Neural networks trained on the collective text of humanity, pattern matching their way through language and logic in ways that Ada Lovelace could never have imagined but might, just might, have recognized as something she glimpsed in 1843. when she wrote that a machine might compose music if its fundamental relations could be expressed in the right symbols. Every bit of that history, every breakthrough and every failure, every late night in a lab, and every argument at a conference, and every moment of pure, bewildered discovery, all of it led to this quiet moment, right now, where you're lying in the dark, and the whole accumulated miracle of computing is humming softly around you. The transistors are switching, the electrons are flowing, the ones and zeros are dancing their endless binary dance, billions of times per second, in perfect silence, in perfect reliability. And you don't have to think about any of it. You don't have to understand any of it. You don't have to do anything at all. The machines will keep computing through the night, as they always do. Tireless, reliable, indifferent to whether anyone is watching. That's the beauty of a machine built right. It just works, and you can rest. So rest. Let the story settle. Let the names and dates and ideas drift where they will. Babbage and his gears, Turing and his infinite tape, Shannon and his switches, Lovelace and her vision, all of it blurring gently into the comfortable darkness behind your eyes. The history of computing is, when you come right down to it, a history of people trying to think better, to reach further, to solve problems that seemed impossible until someone solved them. And they did. Again and again and again. They did. And they're still doing it, right now, all around the world, while you sleep. The work continues. The switches keep switching. The electrons keep flowing. And you can let go.